What's really going on in Washington, D.C., especially in the context of foreign policy and the aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal fiasco? So where are we, Dr. Carafano, in terms of our relationship with the rest of the world?
Good news, bad news story. And I think the bad news I want to talk about briefly is the constricting, I think, foreign policy space that the president has in Washington. But perversely, I actually think this is actually probably good news for a number of allies, and actually I think very good news for South Korea. I think the president's space to do wide initiatives on foreign policies actually dramatically shrunk in the first few months, and that's relatively unusual for a new president, the first months in office, particularly one who has such a long pedigree in foreign policy and such an experienced foreign policy team. And it's not just Afghanistan, which I think many Americans are deeply dismayed about how the withdrawal took place, the implications for future US security. But it's not just that issue. There have been others. There were protests in Cuba. There's a large dissatisfaction with the president's response to that. There's a lot of concern about the president's policies on our southern border, where we continue to see actually expanding illegal migration. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with the president's initiative, removing US obstacles to Nord Stream 2 and how that advantages the Russians. So there are a number of things, I think, that have made the foreign policy establishment more skeptical of the president. And that, I think, narrows his room for maneuver. But conversely, I actually think it's mostly good news for allies. And I'll talk about two things very briefly. The one thing President Trump did actually very convincingly among Republicans and conservatives is really reinvigorate the idea of peace through strength. And that combination of, yes, we will support a strong defense if you are prudent in using it, was broadly accepted across Republicans. And there seems to be very dramatic bipartisan support for that. And so, for example, even in the debate over the defense budget now, you see Republicans and Democrats coming together and dramatically increasing the defense budget proposal above what President Biden had proposed. For forward presence and America working with allies and defending our interests around the world and having a military that's well funded and adequate to do that, there is strong support for that. That, I think, is good news for allies. The other thing I think is good news for allies is if you look at how this administration plans to engage with the significant threats to regional stability, whether it's North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, or the administration has policies very, very similar to the Obama administration in that they would really like to get to equilibrium. And in the case of Russia and China particularly, they really have this vision of this idea of compete, but also cooperate. Well, the problem with this model is almost none of these competitors really have things that the United States can offer them that they need. So just offering things to them in a positive incentive is very unlikely to gain their cooperation. And because of the decreased space that President Biden has, there's very little room for him to really make accommodates and concessions. What that will mean is very quickly the administration will run out of space essentially to engage with competitors. And so if they're going to be proactive on foreign policy, they're going to have to engage more with allies who are dealing with the competitors. And that, I think, actually means something this administration already wants to do, which is to engage more with allies. And I'll just end with a very quick example.
Before we get to Afghanistan, I think the headwinds were starting in on Joe Biden already because things were starting, like in many places globally, inflation was starting to creep into the conversation in everyday life in this country about the fact that when people were going to the grocery store, COVID is hitting the United States again, and he was going to get it under control. And then then the border started creeping in, and people were starting to see that over 200,000 people were entering illegally across the southern border. And people were starting to question, Does this administration know what it's doing? Afghanistan politically, the reason why it's such a disaster for Joe Biden is it emphasized everything that was starting to catch up with Joe Biden. Again, not a well thought out withdrawal, that people are starting to question whether or not the policies of President Biden are the policies that they thought that they were getting in November. And I think, that is what the political bomb for Joe Biden is. And it's evident in the polling.
Hey, I was around 25 years ago when the consensus view from me at the Heritage Foundation, from my liberal friends at the Brookings Institution or the Peterson Institute, from my friends at American Enterprise and Center for Strategic International Study, we all got together and we said, yes, China should be admitted to World Trade Organization. Yes, China should get most favored nation status from the United States, because that will force China to obey the international rules of the road, to be a good actor internationally. That happened, and they were admitted. They still, incidentally, take advantage of the situation inside the World Trade Organization, where, despite the fact they're the second largest economy in the world, as we all know, they still claim to be a developing country, which means basically they can steal intellectual property and get away with it from other countries. It means that they get all their commitments from the World Bank or the international financial institutions at heavily subsidized rates, subsidized by Korean and American taxpayers, because Korea gave up its developing status several years ago. So China doesn't play by the rules, and we've seen this for some time in the United States, and you add that to Uyghur persecution, to what happened in Hong Kong. But in the United States, there is a new reality with regard to China from U.S. policy. It's no more the good old days of George W. Bush or Barack Obama, Republican and Democrat respectively. It's a new kind of, if you will, Trump-Biden China policy, where Trump put in effect some pretty tough restrictions and requirements on China. And Biden, instead of removing them, has in fact been strengthening them.
Dr. Fuller, your counter perspective or points, but let me also inject one more thing here. Whenever you come to Korea, whenever you visit Asia, it seems to be always new issues are popping up. And this time, obviously, it's a lot more convoluted and complicated. Now, keeping in mind, as a long-time watcher on the Korean Peninsula and Asia, how would you advise or, share your perspective with our allies and friends in Asia, especially?
Wow. That's a big challenge, Anthony, but let me reaffirm something right here in Seoul. Afghanistan and America's withdrawal from Afghanistan is a tragedy on the personal level and a humiliation on the national security and world stage level. But it's very different from what we have here in this particular bilateral relationship. We don't have to do that here in Korea. The United States has had troops here for more than 70 years. We are brothers and sisters standing side by side with each other. The American commitment to the bilateral relationship with the Republic of Korea is very real and very, I think, very uniformly accepted on both sides, to the point where on this particular trip, I've had a very senior ROK government official say to me, well, some of my friends in Washington say that here in Seoul, we have to choose between China and the United States. That's false. We believe in our alliance, in our friendship with the United States, and yes, we have to do business with China, but the United States and the ROK are true partners, which is not true with China.